So, did 3dfx ever make a bad product? Is there a Voodoo card that just isn't any good? Well, let's find out. I'm Will, and this is RetroTechBytes. Today, we're going to take a look at this beauty. This is a 3dfx Voodoo Rush, specifically the Jazz Multimedia Adrenaline Rush 3D. Released by Jazz Multimedia in 1997, this is, well, a Voodoo Rush, which was 3dfx's first 2D and 3D card. Integrating an Alliance 2D core with a 3dfx Voodoo, yes, this is a complete Voodoo 1, this card was an all-in-one solution that saved you a PCI slot, as well as the hassle of no loopback cable. So why is it kind of unknown then, relative to the Voodoo 1? Why is it unloved? There's a variety of reasons, but hey, the first of which, it's slower than a Voodoo 1. Yup, that's right, it's slower. So you're probably thinking, Will, what's wrong with you? This card's got a killer blue PCB and just screams that late 90s fast vibe. And yeah, it does. It's an awesome card, but here's where it starts to kind of fall apart. For the 2D core, you have an Alliance Semiconductor AT3D, which, yeah, it's a 3D card. We'll get to that in a minute. But you already know it's a problem when you're using another company's 3D card as your 2D card. And it's a problem for both that company and for you. It's got 2 megabytes of RAM and is clocked at 72 megahertz, and it's 128-bit. And then you have a Voodoo 1, same specs as a standard Voodoo 1. It's got 4 megs of EDO RAM, and it's clocked at 50 megahertz, both on the core and on the RAM. So for all intents and purposes, this is a Voodoo 1, an Alliance AT3D or AT25, whatever you want to call it, because they're both actually the same thing. And it's all on one card, one solution, one connector. So what's the issue with it? Well, yeah, like I mentioned earlier, it is slower than a Voodoo 1, due mostly to memory design and bandwidth considerations. I'll talk a little more about that later. But the Alliance card, that's an issue. Let's take a look. What do you know? Here's the Alliance card. When the 3dfx Voodoo Rush was originally sold, it was actually sold as one of these cards with a special VR bus connector that connected to a daughter board that was the Voodoo Rush. It was essentially a Voodoo 1 that clipped onto an AT3D. This is the AT3D by itself. Why you would ever buy this, I have no idea. But, yeah, we'll get to that. This is the 4 megabyte variant, so this is actually the top end. This one doesn't actually have a producer, but I suspect it was one of the various Chinese companies that manufactured it. For the most part, the AT3D is nothing spectacular. It's a rebrand and upgrade of the AT24 2D core, which later became the AT25 when it was, yeah, not the Alliance 3D, when it lacked the 3D portion. But as far as the card goes, it's uninspiring and it's not great. In 2D, it's middle of the road, not the fastest, and in 3D, it's a problem. We're not going to talk about the 3D yet. But you would buy one of these and you could get the Voodoo daughter board that clipped onto it, and yeah, you were buying from a reputable company. You were probably buying the Hercules Stingray 128 3D, which was not a cheap card by any means. Priced at anywhere between $100 for the base variant, actually $129, and $300 including the Voodoo portion on the daughter board. It was quite an expensive card. So why are we talking about this? Well, this is sort of the Achilles heel of the Voodoo Rush. It's a very bad 2D core combined with a Voodoo in a way that doesn't offer inspiring performance in either 2D or 3D. You'd be better off buying a Voodoo 1 and a S3 Verge or an S3 Trio or a Trident or anything. You could even buy this card, just not on the same card, sharing memory bandwidth and sharing a PCI slot. That's the key. So, let's talk about it. Clearly there was a misstep, but let's explore and see why the 3dfx Voodoo Rush is the Dr. Jeckyll and Mr. Hyde of the 3dfx lineup. The Voodoo Rush, specifically the Jazz Multimedia Adrenaline 3D you see here, was marketed as a high-performance card. It was 3dfx's answer to cards like the NVIDIA Riva 128 and the ATI 3D Rage Pro Turbo, which were starting to offer compelling alternatives to the Voodoo 1. It was an all-in-one solution and didn't require any fancy bridge cables or anything of that sort. It just worked. And it was fast, and yeah, it was a Voodoo 1. And in 1997, the Voodoo 1 was still cream of the crop. The Voodoo Rush, therefore, was a natural expansion. Where the Voodoo 1 lacked any 2D capacity, the Voodoo Rush was supposed to offer that on a single board, and it was supposed to offer it in a way that, well, any mainstream gamer could just pick up and play. It was a simple design and actually quite intuitive, because most of the 3dfx competitors at the time actually had a 2D core integrated, notably the Riva 128 and the, again, ATI 3D Rage Pro Turbo. And on paper, the Voodoo Rush was a compelling product. Listed on this chart are a number of Voodoo Rushes, including the Jazz Adrenaline Rush 3D that will be used in this video. However, upon closer inspection, the Rush's offering as a value proposition seems to fade. Despite being $200 in street price, at least for the Jazz Adrenaline Rush 3D, when compared to something like the Diamond Stealth 2 S220, which has been covered before on this channel, the rendition-based offering just seems to make more sense. In 2D, it offers similar performance, but in 3D, it's actually a faster card, and it's half the price at $110. And the thing is, well, the Voodoo Rush was priced pretty high for performance that wasn't there. Sure, it offered MPEG-1 decoding, but so did most of the competition. And sure, it had a decent RAM deck, but so did most of the competition. So what made it stand out? Well, the 3dfx name for one, but again, why buy it when you could buy a Voodoo 1 and get a better product? Speaking of, let's talk about performance. The card itself is a competent accelerator, but it by no means is competitive with a Voodoo 1. It's about 10 to 15% slower in most applications, and for the most part, the only thing it offers is convenience and the 3dfx name. In fact, when reading reviews like this one, well, the one thing that you can note is that the drivers are a snap to install, but that doesn't really tell us much about performance. And yet, almost every Voodoo Rush review reads the same way. The drivers are easy to install. The card is a single board solution. But where's the performance? We get the 3dfx name, but that's about it. While reviews seem mostly positive, which I speculate is probably due in part to the goodwill of the 3dfx name, for the most part, other cards were the star of the show. Here you can see where the ATI All-in-Wonder Pro based on the 3D Rage Pro core actually beat out the 3dfx Voodoo Rush and the Riva 128 as an editor's choice proposition by PC Magazine. To a certain extent then, the 3dfx Voodoo Rush was a failed grasp at what would later become the 3dfx Voodoo Banshee. The Voodoo Banshee was based on the Voodoo 2 core and offered excellent performance in 3D and 2D, and was just a great card all in one. The fact is, the 3dfx Voodoo Rush was just an imperfect application and imperfect implementation of two discrete cards on one board. Something that, well, in retrospect, probably shouldn't have happened, and despite moving the company forward, really wasn't necessary. While I admit that that's perhaps a bit of a bold claim at least, the fact is, in 3D benchmark tests, the Voodoo Rush is nothing special. It's in some regards slower than a Voodoo 1, and yeah, why not just buy a Voodoo 1? Take a look here. Remember that Diamond Stealth 2 S220 I mentioned based on the Rendition Verity V2200? Yeah, that's a card that's actually slower than a Voodoo 1, and here it is thrashing the 3dfx Voodoo Rush. So what's the deal? Here's some awesome research from Vintage 3D as to what's actually going on in this Voodoo Rush and why it's so much slower. And well, there's two main reasons that they were able to uncover here. The first is related to the fact that the Voodoo Rush implements what's called pseudo-unified memory architecture, which is used to connect the 2D and 3D devices through pins of the frame buffer memory. And what happens is, this creates some overhead. So this additional overhead, coupled with additional bandwidth and capacity constraints based on this unified memory architecture, or rather, pseudo-unified memory architecture, yeah, the system itself is just a slower implementation. Second, and perhaps more poignantly, is the memory organization. Here, performance loss is caused by the way that certain tiling and pixels are organized within the frame buffer, and the Voodoo Rush's implementation of memory organization is just really poor. The differences from the Voodoo 1 cause, more issues in terms of actual, filling and just memory performance in general. Perhaps high-speed CPUs show this more, is what is theorized, but the reality is this is just evident by, well, the results that you can see on the right here. Voodoo 1 beats the Voodoo Rush soundly in every single pixel fill category. And yet, despite its deficiencies, the Voodoo Rush is still a really compelling product. Or at least that was the thought at the time, as put forth by PC Mag here in terms of its finalists for 1997 hardware development. The Voodoo Rush really was part of that definitive late 90s 3D accelerator era, and the Voodoo Rush itself, being the first 3dfx product to implement 2D and 3D on the same card, raised a lot of buzz. The card itself definitely was a step in the right direction for the company in terms of implementing a 2D core as well as a 3D product. 3dfx, though, is perhaps better remembered for the Voodoo 2, which itself lacked a 2D core. So at the end of the day, while the Rush definitely marked a step in the right direction and led to ultimately the Voodoo Banshee and the Voodoo 3, that's exactly where this all begins and ends, a step in the right direction. And that's precisely what this card is. And now, a word from our sponsor. Or rather, should I say, a word about the 2D portion of the card, the Alliance Semiconductor ProMotion AT3D. You see it right here, and yeah, while this ain't a Voodoo Rush, it also really ain't anything special. And here's why. While other versions of the Voodoo Rush use a Macronix part, we're not going to talk about that. Let's focus on the AT3D for a second. I immediately knew something was screwy when I purchased my Voodoo Rush and received this notice in the box. The 3dfx drivers for some reason set the 2D portion of the card to 72 MHz. The Alliance AT3D was sold with a core clock of 61 MHz. This 11 MHz overclock yields instability and all sorts of graphical glitches. Right out of the box! In fact, the AT3D was actually sold as a 128-bit 2D, 3D, and video multimedia accelerator for computers. Supposedly it delivered true state-of-the-art 3D acceleration. Blech. And it had a on-chip hardware geometry setup capability. Blech. So yeah, the quote-unquote fast frame rates of console gaming were supposed to come to the PC platform via this card. That didn't happen. And yeah, no, it's bad. It's really bad. I'm not gonna lie to you, it is terrible. Alliance made all sorts of promises about the AT3D, but it's just one horrible card. The actual 2D image is just terrible, and the fact is it's quite dull and washed out. And the 2D acceleration, yeah, it's almost non-existent. Worse yet is the fact that the drivers quite literally are broken in all regards. Most games look like something out of a 60s psychedelic painting. It makes absolutely no sense that something like this was allowed past QA, and yet, well, here it is, and it's on a 3dfx product. Go figure. Speaking of making it past quality control and quality assurance, the datasheet for the card is just as ambiguous as the history and actual production of the card itself. For the most part, Alliance promises all of these features, and yet, well, it doesn't seem like any of them were truly delivered. But yeah, datasheets and technical stuff is only half of what y'all are here for. So let's put this thing to the test. We'll start with the Voodoo portion of the card and give it a run and compare how games look in 3dfx accelerated mode using Glide versus software. And then we'll transition and take a look at the Alliance AT3D and see what that card could do by itself if you are one of the poor deranged souls that purchased a Hercules 128 without the Voodoo portion. And on that note, let's play some games. First up is a classic, Pod with 3D acceleration provided by the Voodoo portion of the Voodoo Rush. Almost immediately, it's clear that the 3D acceleration provided by the Rush is more than adequate. And how do I know it's more than adequate? Well, this is actually running on a Pentium Pro at 200 MHz without any MMX enhancements. Pod was designed to take advantage of MMX instructions introduced with the Pentium MMX in 1997, and yet here it is running on a much earlier processor that, while powerful, is certainly not as fast nor as capable as what it was intended to be run on. And it looks great, and it runs smooth. Next up, let's play a little Quake 2 on this Pentium Pro and see how the Voodoo Rush handles Quake 2 on what is, well, a pretty old processor. This is currently running at 640 by 480 and it runs great and looks great too. Come take a look. In fact, the Rush is so powerful that the game actually runs just fine at 800 by 600 as well. To tell the truth, the main reason I'm not using 800 by 600 though is because the Rush, well, as I mentioned before, it's limited in memory considerations and you can already see some hitches at 640 by 480. Where Voodoo 1 in this Pentium Pro would be more than comfortable at 800 by 600, the Voodoo Rush definitely shows some of its architectural and design limitations, especially when you consider that a Voodoo 1 does the job just as well, if not significantly better. Next up is another classic design for 3dfx cards, Need for Speed 2 Special Edition. Here it is running on the Voodoo Rush and yeah, it looks and plays fantastic. Last but not least, here is Unreal Tournament 99 running on a Pentium Pro 200 with the Voodoo Rush. This is currently running at 512 by 384, which gives it really the best frame rate. The game actually runs pretty well when you consider that it lacks, again, all multimedia extensions, and on top of that, the processor itself by the time this game came around was ancient. This doesn't even meet the minimum requirements for the game, and yet here it is running and looking pretty solid. I wouldn't say this is fantastic, but it sure is playable.
That was nasty. Die, bitch. Loser. That had to hurt. Anyone else want some? Got it. Nice.
And now, the moment you've all been waiting for. Let's test the Alliance AT3D in some games. While this is the 2D portion of the Voodoo Rush, it is also horrible, and you're about to see why. The drivers are so bad, they even break in-game music. Before going any further, my sincerest apologies. Almost immediately, it looks like Shogo's going to run. The truth is, the game is kind of running. You can see texture glitches and yet nope, I have no idea what's happening. I am so sorry that you are witnessing in this, but this is what the Alliance 3D is all about. Yep. Nope, this is a game, I think, All jokes aside, this is just how bad the drivers for this thing are. This is unacceptable. This is the game running at 640 by 480, if you can even call it running. And do note, just to put the cherry on top of this horribleness sandwich, yeah, the game crashed to desktop. Come take a look. Next up, let's ruin another game. Pod, which I've already shown earlier. On the right is the game being run on the 3dfx Voodoo Rush. You've already seen that. But on the left is the game being run on the Alliance 3D. Again, this is just unacceptable. I don't understand how something like this could be produced and sold to the public, and yet here it is, and it definitely was. The fact remains that something really sketchy is going on with this card, and it literally just cannot handle texturing of any kind. It's quite evident that not only is the driver model broken, but the hardware itself is probably broken too at some level. This is seriously just disgusting, and I am sorry you have to witness it, but yep, this is Pod. Yeah, this is Turok, I think. Either way, the game's supposed to look like the right, and yet, yeah, what you're seeing on the left, that's the game I can't even say running. You know what? Honestly, I don't even know what to say. That's something, and it is beautiful. It is an absolute work of art, and I hope that you enjoy, because it is just absolutely fantastic. I legit don't think a single game works right on this card. Look at incoming. Nothing looks right. And this is a game that's absolutely gorgeous when it runs properly. And yet here it just looks like... Geez, I don't even know what it looks like. And it lags too. I mean, come on. This is just crazy. But yep, this is the Alliance AT3D doing its work. You can even see right there, literally the smoke doesn't even look right. I mean, come on. But hey, at least we got triangle helicopters flying across the screen. Isn't that entertainment? Y'all want to see something funny? Take a look at this. Yeah, Tomb Raider 2. That's the game, right there.
Together for me to clear the gap. Run back to the start and try again.
Alright, so you just bought this thing and want to try Unreal. You fire it up and this is what you see. Is this art? No, this is Unreal. I don't even know what to say, honestly. I mean, this is unacceptable, but at the same time, it's quite comical. And you know what? Take a look at that FPS. We're getting 4 FPS. For the record, this is actually on a Pentium III 600. How on earth that's acceptable, I'll never know. But you know what? Let's play some Unreal. For the final game in our assortment of psychedelic art is Half-Life. Yeah, no, this is not what Half-Life 1 should look like, and the fact that the game is being played this way is probably the most sacrilegious thing I've ever done. I apologize to Valve, and I apologize to Gaben for everything. This is madness. That being said, let's take a moment to reflect. Was the Voodoo Rush a bad card? Not really, but it wasn't the 800 by 600 capable gaming monster that it was advertised as. It wasn't the all-in-one replacement for the Voodoo 1 that it really should have been. Was it a step in the right direction for 3dfx? Almost certainly. But was it the product that they really needed at that time? If you're a 3dfx collector, you might be interested in picking up a Voodoo Rush. But if you're interested in using the Rush as your main card on a retro gaming PC, I can't really recommend it unless you're short on PCI slots and don't feel like using a loopback cable. Even then, it might be worth just sucking it up anyway, because the Voodoo 1 is that much faster. The fact remains that the Voodoo Rush is an imperfect execution of what is otherwise a perfect concept. A Voodoo 1 with integrated 2D. What's better than that? Well, truthfully, a Voodoo 1, when you consider the 2D chip is actually a failed 3D chip produced by Alliance Semiconductor. This isn't to say that all of Alliance Semiconductor's products are bad. This is to say that the Alliance AT3D is probably the worst 3D accelerator ever produced. It's so bad that it's even a poor 2D accelerator in its implementation on the Rush. This card is truly the Dr. Jeckyll and Mr. Hyde of graphics cards. For the purposes of GPU June, it really is an interesting case study. It's a confusing one, to say the least. The Voodoo Rush is a product that really should be great, and by all measures is a great card, but it's unnecessarily handicapped by that Alliance chip, and when you consider that the Alliance chip was sold separately and in a way that ran games like this by a company like Hercules that made very, very high-end products, this is unacceptable. This is insane. And this is another episode of RetroTechBytes. Thanks again for watching, and I hope you enjoyed. If you enjoyed these videos, I really wanted to just say thank you. It's been an absolute pleasure to work on GPU June, and I highly recommend you check out all the awesome content from all the other creators participating. I'll include a link to the playlist below, but just know that you can't go wrong with any of them. Thank you, Nathan, for putting this on, and thank you, Pixel Pipes, for being an absolute source and treasure of knowledge when it comes to GPUs. Being a part of this has been an absolute blast, and I can't thank you enough. To those of you who are new to the channel, welcome. I hope you stick around. And to those of you who have come back, thanks again for your unyielding support. I greatly appreciate it and look forward to seeing you all in the next video.
Will commence this evening at 1900 hours in the Level 3 facility. The security personnel will be used in a secret secure access transmission. Remember, more lives than your own may depend. Do you have a friend Fiddlestick who would make a valuable addition to the Black Mesa team? Immediate openings are available in the areas of materials handling and low clearance security. Please contact the Black Mesa personnel for information. Associated about the areas of physics, biotechnology, or other disciplines. Please contact our civilian equipment division. A reminder to all Black Mesa personnel. Radiation and biohazard screenings are a requirement of continued employment in the Black Mesa Research Facility. Missing a scheduled analysis or radiation checkup is grounds for immediate termination. If you feel you have been